The blood was gone before Christmas. Not all of it, not everywhere, but in the field stations nearest the front, in the worst days of the German offensive that opened on December 16, 1944, the surgical teams were making decisions nobody had drilled for. The wounded came in faster than the supply system could keep pace. By the third week of December, some hospitals in the Bastogne perimeter had worked through their whole blood reserves and were sending requests up the chain that wouldn't come back answered in time for the man on the table. Private First Class Raymond Hess, 19 years old, from Ronks, Pennsylvania, was one of the men on those tables. He'd been hit by German artillery near Lancaster, on the western edge of the Bastogne perimeter, on the afternoon of December 23rd. He lost enough blood between the forward position and the aid station that the medic who rode with him on the stretcher filled out his paperwork twice. The first time, he wasn't sure it needed to be filed at all. Raymond was alive when he arrived at the field hospital. He needed blood. The hospital was running critically short on the type that could help him. If you want more stories from the Second World War, go ahead and subscribe right now. Let me back up for a second, because to understand what that hospital was dealing with in December of 1944, you need to understand what the Third Army had just done in the 72 hours before Raymond got there. Not from the operational maps, from the ground. By mid-December, Patton's army had been grinding east toward Germany for months. Through France, through Lorraine, deep into the Saar. They were exhausted. Then the Germans hit the Ardennes on December 16th, and the whole picture changed in a matter of hours. On December 19th, Patton stood at a briefing in Verdun and told Eisenhower he could pivot his army 90 degrees, from pointing east to pointing north toward Bastogne, and begin the attack in 48 hours. The room went still. An army doesn't do that. An army in the middle of its own offensive, in winter, in mud and ice, doesn't turn 90 degrees in 2 days. Patton did it in 72 hours, and the relief column reached Bastogne on December 26th. What that pivot cost in human damage is worth sitting with. The Ardennes in December 1944 was some of the most brutal terrain and weather American soldiers encountered in the entire European theater. Snow deep enough to swallow a man to his knee, and temperatures that jammed weapons, froze medical supplies, and turned every road into a gamble. Men on the forward positions were getting frostbite at a rate that took some units out of action without a shot being fired. Artillery was constant. Ambushes were constant. The wounded came back from the line in numbers that overwhelmed the receiving capacity of every field station in the area. The medical units moved with the advance the way they always did, setting up in whatever shelter the Belgian countryside provided, stone school buildings and farmhouses and captured German facilities, and working with what they had. Now, here's the thing about blood in December 1944. The Army had built a whole blood distribution system that was genuinely remarkable by the standards of any previous war. Whole blood flown from the United States, processed, typed, packed in ice, distributed down to the divisional level. It had been calibrated for the pace of the fall campaigns. The Bulge blew that calibration apart inside of 3 days. The German offensive generated casualties at a rate and in a geography that the system hadn't been designed for. By Christmas Eve, requests going up the supply chain from hospitals near the front were outrunning the capacity to respond. Type O negative, the universal donor blood you use when there's no time to type the patient and you need to start a transfusion right now, was running out at a rate nobody had planned for. The surgeons who had it were rationing it. The ones who'd run through their stores were operating on improvisation and luck, and whatever they could get transferred from the next unit over, which was sometimes not much. Stay with me. Raymond Thomas Hess had been farming tobacco and corn in Lancaster County since he was old enough to be useful in a field. His father Morris had a bad back from years of that kind of work and hadn't been drafted. His sister Edna was the first person in the family to finish high school and take a teaching job in Strasbourg. Raymond was planning to be the second. He was 19 in December of 1944, and he'd been writing home from France twice a week since October. The letters were careful and short, the kind a young man writes when he doesn't want his parents picturing too clearly what the days actually look like. The letter he mailed on December 20th arrived at the farm on the 28th. By then, Morris and Elsie Hess had stopped going to the mailbox together, because one of them needed to stay composed. He was in his third day on the Bastogne perimeter when the .88 round came in on December 23rd. He didn't feel the shrapnel immediately. That's how it works, often enough in the first seconds. He knew he was down. He knew the ground was cold and that the men around him were shouting. The medic who got to him was working by feel more than sight, pressure and a tourniquet and get him back, and on the ride to the aid station, Raymond was conscious in the way that doesn't mean much. He made it to the field hospital before nightfall. What the note said about his condition on arrival was the kind of language that means a man is alive, but the margin is not something you want to rely on. He needed blood. The type he needed was nearly gone. Here's what doesn't make it into the history books about Patton's relationship with his wounded during the Bulge. He went to them. More than his rank required, more than the operational tempo would have suggested was possible. He moved through his medical units during those December weeks the way he moved through everything, without announcement, in person, reading the actual situation on the ground. The nursing staff at more than one field hospital during that period later described an expectation of the Patton they knew from the headlines, the speeches, the ivory pistols, the theatrical voice that carried across a formation, and then describing what actually arrived when he came through their doors as something quieter and harder to categorize. He walked the rows of cots. He stopped. He talked to men who were going to make it and men who were not going to make it, and he sat with them in a way that the people who witnessed it said wasn't for the room. It was for the man on the cot. Picture the hospital. A requisitioned Belgian school building somewhere south of Bastogne. Windows taped against the cold. Generator light, yellowish and flat, falling over rows of cots placed closer together than the building was meant to hold. The smell of antiseptic and cold stone and blood that had been present so long it had stopped registering as a smell to the people who worked there. Outside, artillery had been audible for days, sometimes close enough to vibrate the glass in the frames. Inside, the medical staff had been working since the 16th without real sleep, moving between patients with the particular efficiency of people whose world has contracted to the square footage of a building and the lives inside it. The supply shelves were being inventoried twice a day because the numbers kept changing, and nobody could afford to miscalculate what they had left. Patton came through a side entrance. He removed his helmet when he entered. One aide, the chief surgeon who had been reached 15 minutes before. He moved through the ward at a deliberate pace, the aide staying back, the surgeon walking alongside him, and what the staff noticed, those who talked about it later, was that his attention was on the men in the cots, not on the building, not on the staff, not on how things were presenting. He was reading the ward the way a man reads a room when he actually wants to know what's in it. Bear with me on this one, because this is where it turns. When the chief surgeon mentioned the blood shortage, mentioned it the way a man raises a supply problem to a general officer who might have the authority to solve it through channels, Patton stopped walking. He looked at the supply shelf the surgeon had gestured toward. He asked how much was on hand. He was given a number. He asked what types were available. He heard the answer. He stood in the middle of that ward for a moment with the generator humming and the men in the nearby cots watching him and the surgical team waiting to see what a four-star general does with a shortage that a phone call might begin to solve. He sat down in a folding chair near the closest available cot, pushed his right sleeve up above the elbow, and told the medic standing nearest him that he was type O negative and to get what they needed. He didn't announce it to the room. A nurse who was on duty in that ward described standing still for a moment because the scene didn't parse immediately. The four-star general of the Third Army, the man who had just pivoted an entire army across 100 miles of winter terrain to relieve a surrounded division, sitting in a folding chair meant for patients, sleeve up, forearm on the armrest. She said she looked at the chief surgeon to confirm what she was seeing. He didn't look back. He was already signaling the medic. He didn't look at the needle when they found the vein. His eyes went instead across the ward, the rows of cots, the equipment, the medical staff around him, the faces of the men in the nearest beds who were looking back at him. Whatever was running through his mind wasn't showing in a way she could read. He was simply present. He stayed until they had taken what they needed. The staff talked about it afterward, those who were there. Some of them talked about it for decades, the way you talk about the things that don't fit cleanly into the category of things you expected to see. What most of them said, when they said anything at all, was that it didn't feel like theater. It felt like a man who looked at a problem and put his hands on the first resource available that didn't require a phone call. What Raymond Hess knew of that morning, if he knew anything at all, is where reconstruction reaches its limit. He was in a cot in a Belgian school building, 19 years old, having lost a significant amount of blood on the way in from the line, conscious in the way that men are sometimes conscious when they're being kept conscious by someone else's effort. Whether he was aware of the activity in the ward, the low voices, the boots on stone floor, the particular quality of the stillness that followed, is something his family said he could never clearly describe. What he knew was that he got blood, that someone who didn't know his name provided what he needed, that he was still alive at Christmas. Let that sit. 19 years old. From Ronks, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. His father Morris with the bad back. His sister Edna teaching school in Strasbourg. His mother Elsie keeping busy back at the farm, which is what you do when keeping busy is the only available substitute for knowing. The next Army communication arrived at the farm in early January, and it was not the kind they'd been dreading. He was alive. He was being treated. He was going to need time. He was in hospitals through January and February, Belgium first, then England, then a transport home in March. He was discharged in September of 1945. He went back to Lancaster County, back to the same fields, tobacco and corn. He married a woman from intercourse named Ruth, and they had 3 children. He farmed that land for the rest of his working life, the same work his father had done on the same ground. He never talked much about the Bulge. What he said when he said anything was that a lot of people kept him alive who didn't know him, and he didn't have words that were adequate to account for all of it. Here's what's genuinely hard to square about what Patton did in that ward. By December 1944, Patton understood the compact between a commanding general and his soldiers in a way that had been personally tested. The slapping incident in August of '43, the field hospital in Sicily, the private he decided was malingering, had nearly ended him. 11 months off the line. The reckoning that followed isn't fully visible in his official record, but shows up in how he carried himself when they gave him the Third Army in 1944. He came back knowing what the commission owed the men it sent forward. He knew it specifically. He'd been shown the cost of forgetting it. But here's the other side of that accounting. Patton was one of the most deliberately constructed public figures of the war. The ivory-handled pistols and the polished helmet, and the speeches that could move a formation like a physical force, those weren't accidents. He understood what he looked like. He understood what his presence created, and he curated it over a career. A man that self-aware about his own image, who rolls up his sleeve in a room full of wounded soldiers and medical staff who are going to carry that story out of the building with them, was that act genuinely private? Or was it the most intimate prop in a very long production? The men who were there mostly said it felt real. One surgeon who worked that hospital through December said Patton was the only general officer he saw in 6 weeks who wasn't there to be seen. but that surgeon couldn't get inside the man's head, and neither can we. What isn't in dispute: the blood was needed. He had it, he gave it. Whatever the motive, genuine solidarity, calculated symbol, or something that was both at once and can't be cleanly separated after the fact, the needle went in and the blood came out, and in that particular respect it didn't matter who he was. The Third Army continued north through December and January, fighting in cold that the history still reached for adjectives to describe. The German offensive was contained by late January. The full accounting of American casualties during the Bulge ran somewhere between 70 and 80,000 across all units. The Third Army's medical units treated more than the system had been built for, and saved the men they could save with what they had. The school building eventually cleared out. The cots were folded, the equipment packed, the generator shut down and loaded onto a truck. The building went back to being a school. The snow in the courtyard melted in January, and the ground under it was just ground. A folding chair beside a cot, a sleeve pushed up above the elbow, the generator light steady through the taped windows, and the ward around it going quiet while someone solved the problem the only way he could think to solve it right then. Raymond Hess was on a transport ship heading west in March, Lancaster County already in his thinking, the farm, his father's back, Edna and her school, Ruth, who he'd been writing to since September and hadn't stopped. The field hospital in Belgium was behind him, going the way that the hard things go when enough distance accumulates. Not forgotten exactly, just blurred at the edges. So here's the question that morning puts on the table, and both sides of it are worth sitting with. If what Patton did was genuine, if the impulse was real and the blood in that chair was the same blood as any private's, and the act meant what it looked like it meant, then it's one of the rare moments in his command where rank and sacrifice met on equal terms. Blood type doesn't care about stars on a collar. The man in that folding chair was type O negative, and that was what the hospital needed to know. And a general who could have solved the shortage through channels or a phone call or the weight of his authority on the supply system sat down and held out his arm instead. That version of the moment is worth something real. But Patton was never fully capable of a private act. He knew what rolling up his sleeve in a ward full of wounded soldiers would produce, the story that travels, the legend that grows. He'd been building that legend deliberately for 20 years. If the act was theater, if the wounded men in those cots were participants in a production they hadn't agreed to, then what they deserved was the phone call. The quiet solution from a building far away from them. Not a 4-star general making their suffering the stage for his most human moment. Was Patton giving his blood to his men, or was he giving his men to his legend? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more untold stories from World War II, make sure you subscribe.